Imagine you were out in public and you found yourself injured. Maybe you were in an accident and couldn't move, or someone had mugged you, and in the ensuing scuffle, you'd ended up getting hurt. Laying on the cold, filthy concrete of the sidewalk in desperate need of help, what could be the one thing that might make you feel even the slightest bit better? Something the very sight of would be enough to tell you everything was going to be okay. The flashing lights drawing closer, accompanied by the sound of tires on the road and a wailing siren, all signs that an ambulance is on its way. But what if the ambulance that came to assist you ended up making you feel far worse than you were before, and leaving you with injuries unlike anything you'd ever seen? What if it wasn't an ambulance at all that came to help you? What if you were found by SCP-4419 instead? Jeremy had been having a somewhat normal day until his accident. Work had been another shift of long, arduous hours spent behind his desk. 5 o'clock finally rolled around. He grabbed his bag and punched out. If he'd maybe left a few minutes later, he might have gotten away unscathed. Instead of getting caught in the mad rush of people leaving work, Jeremy usually took the back streets and avoided main roads as a shortcut to get home. There was less traffic, even during the rush, and that made crossing the streets safer, usually. He had been looking the other way when a car came speeding down the mostly empty side street. The driver had slammed the brakes, but only too late, knocking Jeremy down. Winded, he collapsed, unable to stand as the force of the impact had broken his leg. The driver and a few nearby onlookers huddled around Jeremy as he lay there with his injury. Suddenly, the noise of an ambulance caused the other pedestrians to mostly disperse. Still trying to catch his breath, in the last moments of his fading consciousness, the last thing he remembered seeing were a pair of figures. They had jostled rather aggressively through the crowd, reaching down to lift Jeremy up and shoved him into the emergency vehicle. They were considerably rude for medical professionals. Nobody around wanted to argue with them. Most would even go so far as to call them hostile, but that was nothing compared to the horror that awaited him when he reopened his eyes, laying back on the road where he'd been found. His body had been rearranged. He barely recognized it as his own. It was like he had been turned into some grotesque animal made using human parts. His arms and legs had been rearranged to protrude from his torso in an unnatural configuration. What felt even worse was that his fingers, toes, hands, feet, they all still worked. All Jeremy could do was scream until he slipped back under. A man turned into something else entirely. Bad days can happen to the best and worst of us, and sometimes those bad days can spiral into very, very bad nights. Mike had been having a night like that. Earlier that day, he'd lost a fair sum of money at the races. Gambling was one of his many vices, as was alcohol, and to commiserate his loss, Mike had hit the bar. Unfortunately, his already foul mood was nudged into full-blown temper when another patron accidentally bumped into him. The ensuing bar fight was a complete, disoriented, drunken mess of glasses being smashed and fists thrown. One managed to connect hard with Mike's jaw, breaking it and leaving him sat on the sidewalk in pain. Cop cars had shown up, officers breaking up the ruckus and paramedics arriving to treat the more badly injured patrons. It was then that 2 paramedics silently walked up to Mike and grabbed him by both arms. As much as he tried to pull away from their forceful grip, his arms were covered in bruises and cuts from the glass. Their fingers dug in, honing in on those painful, wounded spots so that Mike could really feel his own injuries as they pulled him up against his will. Trying to verbally protest only hurt his jaw further, meaning he could barely call for help as he was bundled into the back of an ambulance, doors slamming shut behind him. The next morning introduced Mike to a whole new and far grislier definition of the word hangover. One of the staff who worked at the bar found him, just waiting outside when she came up to open for business a few days later. Sitting out front, Mike had been left in the gutter, although it took the bartender a moment to notice just what was wrong with him, and when she saw it in full, she screamed. Instead of Mike's jaw being fixed, it had been wrenched open, far wider than natural. It was locked in a permanent, gaping expression, the sides of his lips sporting splits that ran all the way into his cheeks. Lodged between both rows of Mike's teeth, fused to his gums, was a piece of glass, too thick for him to break to free his jaw or even bite down on. a mouthful of glass shards and blood, cuts lining the inside of his cheeks, fragments lodged inside his tongue. All of that might have been preferable, a mercy, compared to what actually happened. The glass was keeping his mouth stretched out, stopping him from speaking like a transparent gag. And as if not being able to speak or beg for help wasn't bad enough, anyone that looked through that little window was also offered a whole other horrific view. They could see Mike's heart. It had been pulled from his chest and reattached at the back of his throat, still beating as tears rolled down his face. He couldn't eat, talk, only breathe through his nose, and it hurt. Reg and Lee had vowed when they first got married to love each other for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, until death did they part. And death very nearly almost parted them. If given the choice between dying together or suffering through what ended up being done to them, not even their love for each other would have made them want to stay alive. The rain was beating down on the windshield as the couple drove home in silence. They'd had a big argument. In fact, it was small in the grand scheme of their relationship, just a lover's quarrel. In that moment, though, it felt like the biggest problem in the world, as those types of squabbles often do. But it would have seemed quaint compared to the fate that awaited both Lee and her husband that night. Visibility was poor. The headlights were doing little to help Reg see through the downpour or the dark. He found it so hard to see that he almost missed their turn, quickly wrenching the steering wheel to try and correct the mistake. Reg lost control of the car as it slid on the slippery road, flipping sideways and rolling as the rain continued to pour. The airbags deployed. The force of being thrown around even with her seatbelt on caused Lee to suffer a number of broken ribs. Meanwhile, Reg's arm was broken when the driver's side door connected with the ground and dented inwards. As the couple were left buckled in their seats, upside down and both crying at the pain of their injuries, they spotted the unmistakable silhouette of an ambulance driving through the rain towards them. They were both so relieved that neither one of them realized they hadn't called the emergency number yet. Although the rain had long since stopped by the time Lee woke back up, the storm was just beginning. Her head was spinning. Everything was sore and aching. She had expected to be in a hospital, maybe with Reg in her bed beside her, both of them recovering but alive at least. Pushing herself up by her cut, bloody hands, Lee could feel something heavy behind her, a weight on her back, like having a rucksack strapped to her, only it was harder to move. Almost the same mass as a person. Slowly looking over her shoulder, Lee screamed when she saw the flesh of her back had been fused to Reg's, their skin melted and stuck together like candle wax, each of them unable to pull away without the pain of feeling like they were being ripped apart. To make matters worse, Lee had undergone other modifications. Talk about in sickness or health. Living alone, Rodney was relatively content with his life. Since retiring, he'd been able to spend his twilight years appreciating the little things, spending most of his time out in the garden, tending to his flowers, and occasionally enjoying the company of his adult son. Unfortunately, with old age comes the increased risk of health problems, and to say Rodney had himself more than his fair share of heart difficulties, or a bum ticker as he called it, was an understatement. While out in his garden, Rodney suffered a violent heart attack and collapsed, wheezing and struggling to breathe. Luckily, his son Keith was in the house at the time. He witnessed his elderly father drop to the ground and ran out to help him, calling for an ambulance as he tried to calm Rodney down. The emergency services seemed to arrive much quicker than Keith had been expecting, a pair of paramedics rushing through the house to lift his dad away. What struck him as strange was neither one would tell Keith which hospital they were taking his dad to, and they outright refused to let him ride in the back of the ambulance to keep Rodney lucid and reassure him that he was in safe hands. When Keith went to climb into the back, one of the paramedics pushed him by the chest with enough strength to knock him over. As he pulled himself off the concrete, the rear door slammed shut and the ambulance sped away to God knows where with Rodney in the back. After a few days of hearing nothing, Keith had already tirelessly been calling every hospital in the area to ask if his dad had been admitted. None of them had seen Rodney, and his worried son had just been about to call the police to file a missing persons report when his elderly father appeared on the doorstep. Immediately, Keith drove his dad to the emergency room, trying to explain what had happened with the strange ambulance. While the hospital maintained that it wasn't one of theirs, They admitted Rodney and gave him a full examination, only to find something that would turn the stomachs of the world's most seasoned doctors. Rodney had more than one heart. Someone had given him not just a spare, but 11 additional hearts. They were stuffed between his natural organs, like too many books squeezed together on a shelf, and not one of them was beating. They were causing far more harm than good. Rodney's insides were riddled with these foreign bodies that were stopping his lungs from fully inflating, resting on his stomach, and wreaking havoc with his bodily functions. Upon discovery of these extra hearts, Rodney was rushed into the operating theater, with his son nervously pacing in the corridor outside. Sadly, a doctor would soon appear to tell Keith that the moment the surgeons removed one of the additional hearts, Rodney's old bum ticker had finally given out. Sometimes, as sad as it may be to reconcile with, tragedy strikes. One night, a fire broke out in a crowded bar, leading to a whole host of people suffering severe burns and requiring urgent medical attention. What they received instead was far more brutal and barbaric. Joyce had been in the bar when the alarms started to ring. Nobody knew what had started it, only that they needed to evacuate. But it didn't take the flames long to reach the alcohol behind the bar, and before long the whole place was ablaze, everyone panicking and barging past each other to get out. Once free of the searing heat, swapping it for the biting cold of the night air, the commotion didn't seem to end. Someone near her pointed to an ambulance that had just arrived, and a duo of paramedics that were manhandling some of the more badly burned bar patrons, forcing them into the back of their vehicle. Along with about 6 others, Joyce marched up as the group protested how the injured drinkers were being treated. When the paramedics refused to stop, things got uglier. The ensuing brawl left Joyce and the other 6 people with skull fractures, but rather than just leave them behind, the paramedics grabbed them too. Joyce was pushed into an already overcrowded ambulance. There were 26 people crammed in there total, including her. 19 of them had nasty burns on their skin, wounds that were only made worse by being packed together in such a tight space and jostled around as the ambulance drove away. There were no sign of the missing 26 bar patrons for around a week. The families of those that had disappeared after the fire urged the police to keep searching for them, with no bodies recovered at the scene by firefighters. Nobody had a clue where the group had gone. Joyce's partner, Al, even printed off missing flyers and handed them out to anyone who would take them. They also happened to be the caretaker of a local community center, and after another day of worrying tirelessly about Joyce, Al moped back there to clean and lock the place up. What they found waiting for them was like something out of an old horror B-movie, or something found in the deepest parts of the ocean. Filling one of the rooms of the community center was a huge, watery mass. It wasn't pure liquid, although Al first mistook it as the result of a leaking pipe. The mass was fluid. It twitched and shivered whenever they reached out to touch it, almost like a living thing, or what was left of a few living things. Say, 26 bar patrons melted down and reduced to a collective liquid mass. Now, you'd think having an accident out in public would be as bad as things got, but that's nothing compared to being injured in the line of duty, right in the middle of a war zone. That's what happened to Private Jackson. While he and his squad were out on a routine patrol in Afghanistan, a group of enemy insurgents ambushed the United States' soldiers. During the ensuing firefight, Private Jackson sustained a severe gunshot wound, leaving him bleeding out. His comrades had called for a medical evacuation and were expecting a U.S. Army helicopter to arrive at any moment. What none of them had expected was a city ambulance driving towards them across the battlefield as if it was the most normal sight on Earth. Already suspicious of the approaching vehicle, Private Jackson's fellow teammates raised their weapons at the approaching paramedics. Despite the soldiers' demands for them to identify themselves, neither one of the ambulance attendants seemed to pay them much mind, grabbing Private Jackson and dragging the wounded soldier towards the vehicle. He called to the rest of his squad, wanting to be let go, having no idea where he was about to be taken or why. The commanding officer barked at the pair of EMTs, warning if they didn't release Private Jackson, then his men would open fire. Still, the paramedics didn't seem to be listening. Just as they threw Jackson into their ambulance and climbed into the cab at the front, the other soldiers opened fire. Squeezing their triggers, bullets were spat from their weapons, riddling the metal sides of the vehicle as it began to drive away, siren blaring and lights flashing. Every shot that connected with the ambulance seemed to cause it to leak a viscous black fluid, like an oil. but despite this, it did little to deter the ambulance from driving away with Jackson captive in the back. After being successfully extracted from the battlefield, the remainder of the squad were airlifted back to safety, arriving back at their nearby base the following day. Each one of them were solemnly silent. All of them were confused as to how an ambulance had even appeared in the desert out of nowhere and disappeared without a trace. But even more so, they were concerned for the life of their kidnapped comrade. However, they wouldn't have to wait long, as arriving at their barracks revealed the grim, grotesque fate of Private Johnson. He was on the walls, as in all over the walls. His body had been dissolved somehow, broken down into little more than a thin, bloody paste that had now been smeared over the interior of the barracks. Looking out at his former squad from the liquefied remains was a single human eyeball, Private Jackson's eye wide with horror at what had been done to him. SCP-4419, known to some by the nickname of the Butcher's Chariot, is still out there. At present, it is unknown who, or indeed what, performs the horrific mutilations on its victims, or even why. It could be that SCP-4419, if it has a consciousness, could be trying to help those it abducts, but lacks the correct medical understanding of how to do so. Then again, it could simply just be cruel, torturing and deforming people unfortunate enough to need emergency medical attention. Given how sporadically this anomalous ambulance can appear and disappear at the site of any medical emergency anywhere on the planet, there's little the Foundation can do other than stay vigilant and pick up SCP-4419's patients after it has mutilated them. Or rather, they can pick up whatever's left of their victims. Now go and check out SCP-2086 Man-Eating Bus for another anomaly that at first takes the shape of an ordinary vehicle, but soon becomes something far more terrifying. And after, keep an eye out for SCP-973 Chased by Smokey for more horror stalking the roads.